Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Burak Yetişkin.
Hi, everyone. I know I am the last thing standing in front of you between the 5-day work week and the weekend. So I know you would like me to be as fast as possible, but I have too much material to present today, and all my findings over the last course of 4.5 years, which I wanted to summarize and walk you through the hands-on experience of what happens when we take enterprise blockchain, not cryptocurrency, that being put aside, but enterprise blockchain applications, which I wanted to summarize in 3 different pockets. One of them being, where do we stand today? Meaning, okay, we're talking about blockchain, it's all on the news, it's on Business Insider, we read about it, but where actually are we really in terms of adoption? The second question I'd like to highlight is, what's the use of it, and how do we collaborate with it? Followed up by, how do we take this technology to a production level, and why we should take this technology to a production level. So think of it in 3 different pillars of how we can assess the feasibility of the technology, where it stands, and how we can further speed up the adoption of it, which I think very much relates to what BCTR is doing today, as to expand the understanding and adoption of the technology. So we'll have some time at the end of the presentation for a Q&A. Please keep your questions, and please keep them in mind, and I'll be very happy to answer them. So when I present blockchain anywhere, in any presentation, I'm very surprised that a technology which was designed to circumvent banks, financial institutions, insurers, everyone, is actually the topic of discussion today in the market, saying that, hey, we as a bank would like to take this technology, apply it to some of our operations, and we'd like to understand which of the core principles of the technology should be taken as the basis. Well, if you were to ask me this 5 years ago, I'd probably think that you're crazy, because after all, Bitcoin, the initial idea of Bitcoin was about how do we take payments and transactions out of a loop that is handled by institutions, and now we're actually asking, well, we as institutions, how do we take the core of the technology to change our platform? In the last 2 years, 2.5 years, I think we read a lot about applications of blockchain technology and everything, but it actually boils down to something very simple. So when we talk about blockchain, I always give the example of all of you right now here walking in, sitting down. Assume that we're making regular meetings every week. Everybody walks in, we pull up our notebook, and as I speak, you might want to take some meeting notes. Typically, how a meeting would happen is you would pull out your notebook, take your notes, and leave the building. You may want to consolidate your notes with your friends, or you may not want to, but it's all up to you. And next week, you'll come again, you'll take your notes, you'll leave the building. On a distributed ledger, we put a technology to limit the way you can write, and what you can write, and how you can write. Also, we make sure that people share your notes. So this is how it would happen. We're in a blockchain note-taking environment. Everybody walks in. You all have to have a blank notebook when you come into the building. Every single note you want to take, you need to communicate that note with everyone else in the room and have over a 50% consensus on what sentence you can write, and everyone has to write that sentence in that exact order. So you know nothing has been written before without your knowledge, you know nothing will be written afterwards without your knowledge, and when you leave this room and come back next week, you're also sure that all notes that had been taken had not been modified, and anything that will be written in your next meeting will also be the exact same sentences that you agree on. This is the basis of blockchain technology today, as we use in most use cases. So everything else either sprouted out from this basis, or had been an add-on, or had used some off-chain capability, or didn't use a consensus mechanism. These are variations, or call it different flavors of the technology. So as the basis, it's about consensus. It's about distribution, meaning that all your notebooks that you walked in with are distributed, you own it, you carry it. And it's how you can guarantee the content in your notebook. So please, let's take this as the basis, and I know that not everyone is very much blockchain accustomed, so to say, to the technology. Take this as the basis, and everything we will speak will consider these bases for the technology's application. So it all starts, of course, with the invention of Bitcoin. There's a lot of mythology behind it. I'm much less interested in that and much more interested in over the time, within a 7-year time span, we started to look into, hey, this actually makes sense. People are using Bitcoin to do things, even if they're just buying things on the dark web. Or, I mean, I remember myself booking a flight to Latin America from Switzerland and back, and buying with Bitcoins, sending my passport copy as a proof of identity. That was the time when people said, hey, probably what this guy is making sense, because you actually can pay for something and pay minimal transaction fees to it, which was, especially for the case of Argentina at the time, it was the case as the Mercado Azul was closed and foreign currency exchanges were limited. What happened is that the use cases were identified. OK, now I can pay without so much transaction fees. Now I can fix the rates. It moved on to, well, let's take a look at these payment cases or other alternative cases which take the principles of blockchain and apply it to different things. That's the year of the use case, which was followed by, well, we have the use case, but how do we make it real? At the time, the technology wasn't as mature, so we didn't know what platform to write on. At the time, we didn't have many of the things, the tools, the applications, the platforms that we have today did not exist, but we knew where we wanted to end up with, based on the very basic principles of the distributed ledgers. So what happened in 2017, which just last year I remember very vividly, by the beginning of the year, we had several financial institutions primarily, followed up by many other industries looking into, well, we have a proof of concept, and the reason why you would create a proof of concept is to verify whether something makes sense. They tested these ideas, the platforms were developing, they had faith that the technology would be invested in, and they said, okay, now let's take a look at how we can take the technology to a larger scale. So the difference, I would say, between the year of the proof of concept, the pilot, and the production is simply an application which is isolated, running on your laptop, versus an application which gets data from sources and parses it out for you. And finally, something that's scalable and big enough, just like we use our daily transaction applications, large volume applications came into place. It didn't follow in every single country at the same pace, but it did follow that the proof of concepts were initially tackled by almost everyone, pretty much in most of Western Europe, Northern Europe, Western Europe, North Americas, as also the Latin Americas as well. Almost 6, 7 months later, you would see applications being built, deployed, and tested. So this was just the brief teaser of what we're going to be talking about. So we have a lot more coming. So where do we stand in blockchain today? Over the 2 years of strategy of assessment, from the year of the proof of concept, the first pilots being pushed in, multiple partners working together, and the production level deployments, what happened is that people learned how to code. This is the case in any new technology. You have an idea, you hear something, you go to trade shows, you meet experts, you assess startups. People flew into the San Jose and Silicon Valley, tried to meet people, asking questions on what they plan to build in the mid, short term, long term, mid term, and then said, okay, now we have some knowledge. We want to understand what platform we will use, how this technology will grow, and whether some of the fallbacks of this technology, shortcomings of the technology were identified. Think of especially scalability was a big topic of discussion as people looked into Bitcoin network and asked themselves, hey, it's 10 minutes of settlement and clearing time. So what can we do to build a new technology to circumvent these challenges? So the first 2 years of strategy, meaning asking the question of should we, or what's the benefit from it, followed up by the POCs, the proof of concepts, had truly fermented in many corporations. So there were some challenges that came with it, the technical progress initially being one of the biggest challenges, followed up by, of course, regulations, especially in relation to money transfer. So today, if I send a cent from the country, I have to report where the money is going to, who I am. If I'm sending money to the US, it has to go through some thorough checks. Well, regulation wasn't in there, so regulatory framework was initially reactive. And I remember some of my meetings where regulators were asking themselves, what is it? Can you explain it to us? It was the very, very beginning, the dawn of the era, so to say. And they started to think to themselves, shall we be reactive as technology develops, or shall we be proactive in creating a framework, a legislative framework, that will help innovators step in and do things? Well, this is what happened. Regulation followed in it to some extent, but legal enforceability didn't follow as fast. So, OK, I can create a cryptocurrency, I can create a smart contract, I can create a tool, you can sign something digitally, but can I take it to court with it? Can I present it as a proof to a judge? So that was the second question that came in place. The third one was social acceptance, because I mean, I could tell you very good examples from my everyday life of me adapting a new technology. I'm still not used to using Facebook even. So would I actually use a technology that would completely change the way I see things, meaning go to a website, put in a password, a username, login, versus having a private key that represents me, and I am the sole eligible person who can act on this knowledge and make transactions, versus losing my password and just asking for the password to be sent to me. Well, the social acceptance and the paradigm shift is significantly more challenging than we initially thought. And this I can easily say from hands-on experience on it. So what did we use this for? We had the technology, we had the challenges, we knew the social challenges that came with it, but record keeping was a very first initial case. So think of a very basic situation. We all have a track record of, let's say, scorekeeping. We're watching, let's say, a TV show, we're watching a soccer game, and we'd like to say, this happened this many times, this many goals were scored. And we all have our own records, but the reconciliation of records is a challenge. I mean, this is a very major issue that you would come among corporations where they do bookkeeping. I can tell you from a multinational point of view, let's say you're a conglomerate with 12 different countries that you operate in, and you need to do settlement and clearing of records, meaning who has how much money will be sent from one country to the other, and you may actually go for an inorganic growth, meaning you can acquire some companies that use completely different technologies that has to talk to the other country, and that one has a completely different back end. It ends up being typically a mess, because the system integration is doable but expensive and takes a long time. Once you do the system integration of using the same tools and operations, you need to do a culture shift, and that also takes, training people takes time. And we're asking ourselves the question, what if we could use this example of all of you walking into this building and taking the same notes as a means of record and bookkeeping? Well, this is what happened. The first group that was interested in this was financial services, certificates, ownerships, validation, verification, bookkeeping as a means of company transfers, funds transfer between entities was a very interesting case, and it was very easy to implement practically. That you could just step in, do a small proof of concept, see if it works, go back to your legal entities and say, please adopt us. Adoption time was short, so this was a very interesting case. But another one was the transfer of value, which is the original Bitcoin case. Relatively difficult from a regulatory standpoint, but very lucrative from a multinational standpoint. Because after all, sending and receiving money is expensive. Even if you're a member of the SWIFT network, even the number of people you need to put into the task, and the money that you send. Plus, there's, of course, security challenges that come with it. So the transfer of value became the second hot topic that most startups had looked into, and also thoroughly assessed the regulatory framework around it that allows us to send and receive money. Naturally, the technology itself was relatively easy, but the challenge was how do we make sure that we're compliant with the existing AML, counterterrorism financing, KYC rules when we send money, even within an organization. So although the technology was mature in there, well, the regulatory framework wasn't in there, and the integration challenges were quite significant. But the third, I would say technically the most complex, and this is, I think, one of the topics where majority of the blockchain applications rely on the smart contracts but are not always successfully executed, was how do we create a smart contract to take action in certain cases. I'll give you a good example. There's a flood or there's a hurricane. We know that a region in the country will be damaged. Housing will be damaged, people will escape, and we will have to know whether the information is valid when claims come in, whether these claims that come from the people who have damaged houses, property, make a claim, and we'd like to know whether it's real. Today, the process would work that you'd come with a report, you'd file this in, you'll make a claim gets approved, and a month later, you get your money. I'll give you my example, me losing my laptop, making a claim, having the money on my account takes around 5-6 weeks, but I had the police report approximately 10 minutes after I left the plane. I noticed my laptop wasn't there. Well, you could create an ecosystem where each and every step of verification could be done by an individual, meaning first lost and found office, and then the police, and then I walk in and make a report, send an email to my insurer asks for my IBAN number, and the money gets transferred, is how it works today. How a smart contract would work today would be completely different. You would have entities who provide information to this ecosystem connected through a network, meaning if I, as an individual, uniquely identified, would make a claim, also report to the police, and the police verifies it, and the insurance automatically gets this information, and if, in most insurance cases, if you have such a stolen claim and theft claim, you can automatically approve below a certain amount, they will simply say, okay, tick, police report valid, claim is valid, IBAN number is registered, we already have the information of the registered insurance policy, and would like to send the funds to them. This could actually be completely automated. Think of another case of me paying my rent every month. There is a repeating dynamic every month. I get my salary on the 24th of the month. On the 1st of the month, that salary gets divided into what I need to pay. My bills, my rent to my landlord, my standard electricity bills, all these are automated. So think of an ecosystem. What if I didn't have to log in and make an automated payment application? Instead, what if I could create a smart contract between me and my landlord, which would also identify my IBAN number, so saying that Burak Yetişkin lives in the street in Switzerland, in Zurich, and on the 1st of the month, go to his, based on his approval of how he signed the smart contract, deduct the rent amount from his bank account, make a check. Well, bank would give it, this would be a part of the smart contract. And you could code smart contracts with such delicacy, so to say, that you can automate the whole process. And you could say, well, if he doesn't have enough money, send him an email and send a notice. And you could say, 5 days later, please check again. Maybe I've had my salary paid a bit late. You never know. You can do a second check, and if there's no money still, ask a notice to the lawyer to send him a letter that the legal process will start. This could be done entirely automated, that the moment I sign my contract with my landlord, the payment process as well as the non-payment process could be coded within the same smart contract. This is a key application of distributed ledgers today, and we see more and more larger smart contract applications coming into play in the industry. So this technology, of course, didn't come out of the blue. There was very interesting use cases. Corporations, enterprises had assessed the feasibility of use cases, but what they did was quite interesting. The technology came mostly from startups. And these startups didn't only look into financial services. These startups look into all industries, telecommunications, media, high technology, financial services being the primary players of the technology. Startups kept on feeding applications on these use cases at different levels of maturity. So the ideas were there, somebody heard of it. If you go to Zug or Zurich, if you go to Trust Square on Bahnhofstrasse, it's a small building. There is a place where you can just have a small coffee and beer, and everybody sits in a balcony, they exchange ideas. Happens usually on a Thursday at 6 p.m. And I try not to miss it. So that area, when you bounce off these ideas, what happens is somebody says, okay, I think I can code this to a prototype or a POC. I can bring it out and expose it to firms which may be interested to either invest in these or buy these assets. Or if they have an investor, they might just go full-scale deployment. So the technology's impact of blockchain's impact on startups was to create a whole ecosystem of ideation to proof of concept, and that had fueled firms who take that as a basis and run their own proof of concept. So as Oliver is here, I think I have to mention UBS, the Technology Lab Level 39, and how that technology was played with, taken as the base substance. And not only UBS, many banks, many institutions, many technologists had collaborated together, taking these startup assets, growing them to an acceptable scale of order, and then saying, well, does this make sense? Does the use case really make sense to deploy if we were to invest in them? I think this was the time when we had this little crack between the connection between the startups and the industries, idea to a small app that could easily be sketched by 5, 6 people in a room in 3 months, all the way to a large corporation which has the funding to take that idea and take it to implementation. So, OK, we have the startups, we have the ideas, we have people putting money in, but what are the key barriers of adoption? So I can't stress enough how legal and regulatory can be very much of a barrier to adoption, or let's say not a barrier, but let's say a framework set that might say you can do this, but you can't do this. A good example is the GDPR, and in Turkey it would be Kişisel Verilerin Korunması Kanunu, where you can't take simply personal information, put it on a distributed ledger, anyone can access and read it. Well, you simply can't do it. That had created, first, initially a barrier, which turned out to be actually a blessing, the way we design blockchain ecosystems, where we hold data, how we transfer data, how we authorize data. We had to rethink everything from a distributed ledger to a GDPR, KVK-compliant distributed ledger ecosystem. The technological barriers of adoption was initially, especially around a year and a half to 2 years ago, was about scalability. Can I actually run this on a XYZ platform? Will I be able to handle 100,000 transactions in an hour, just as I would if I had a bank and the credit card transactions were coming in and out? Can I have the same order of scale and capacity on a distributed ledger? Well, this wasn't possible. So what happened is we knew what to develop and still take the bases of the technology of consensus, of distribution, of immutable information, take portions of it or modify it entirely to make it fit our needs. And that was, I think, one of the key challenges we had in the beginning was, can I actually run this on a distributed ledger or not? I have experience building something that when we tested, OK, this just doesn't work. The spike test just doesn't work. And that's an experience you build upon once you start to play with it. That's why I always stress, build a POC, test the information, do a spike test, find out whether it makes sense. And if it doesn't, pull the plug. Keeping it longer doesn't make sense. So now that we talk about what's going on, how we came here, and who's doing what, and how startups have been sparkling this, my main thought was about how do we move from proof of concept to production. This information I see as quite unique, because many may attempt to build a proof of concept, and it's relatively easy. 5 people in a room, usually around 12 weeks, 16 weeks' time, you should be able to finalize the proof of concept work. It's relatively easy, but that doesn't mean that you can go to production. The time it took me to build a POC would be less than a quarter of a pilot application. And the difference isn't that big at all in the beginning. That happened for 2 reasons. One, either because the business case wasn't very developed, so once we had the proof of concept, moving to pilot, people objected to what we're building for all the good reasons, because the use case didn't make sense. 2, the technological barriers prevented us from building something that's tangible, and we simply had to wait for the new version of an application to come. So as for addressing question 1, we should ask the very simple question, what are we doing? I was very surprised that in the very beginning days of blockchain technology, everybody wanted to build something, but nobody really knew why. Some people did, and some people even took that to the level of consortia and growing ecosystems, but some of them were just built to have it built. So Barsuchis has a very interesting and somehow now revised decision tree. Why should we use a blockchain? We already talk what it is. We have a notebook, we take notes, we make sure that it's not altered, we all write at the same time, all very interesting topics, but do we actually need to keep record of anything? Do we need to verify anything? So that question is a key, essential question. Can we do it such that one single person can hold all the data, and I can go back and ask, does this make sense? There is the case, for example, of diamonds, right? Everledger, I'm sure you heard of it, where you can verify the authenticity of a diamond, and it's written on the side of the diamond. You can go to a website, and the hash of that information is written somewhere, so relatively easy process. But at the same time, there are 2 entities that verify these diamonds, put an ID right next to it, engrave it on the side of the diamond, and you can go to the website of this entity, simply punch in the number, and ask whether this actually is the original diamond. Relatively straightforward. A centralized entity can also hold information where you can verify things. You don't have to always use a blockchain. And that's the question you should ask yourself before even starting a proof of concept. So do we actually trust everyone? Is there a conflict of interest between entities who are a part of the ecosystem? Or are we working towards the same goal? If we're all team members, can one person keep record of everything and we just ask him? Because why should he alter the data? We're going the same direction. We have the same goal. Does it make sense? Or does it not make sense? And if it doesn't make sense, why are we doing blockchain? These are the essential questions that you should ask at the POC level, even before the POC level if possible, whether it makes sense to proceed with your application. So not to make us feel a bit questioning about the technology, but the use of blockchain strictly relates to a need where you have multiple players in the same ecosystem sharing and verifying information. And likely these multiple players have either a conflict of interest or an incapability to share information. So this could be the inorganic growth, the acquisition case, where you have several back ends which can't talk to each other, and doing an implementation will take you millions. In such cases, again, although there is no conflict of interest, it might still make sense. So Barsucci's tree, if you look at it, is consensus. Are the writers united? They have a united interest? Or do I need to control functionality? Do I want everyone to see this information? Or do I want to keep information shared on the network confidential? These are the key questions to ask initially before taking your use case to either a POC or a pilot level. And this is a very good base. Well, how do we take it to the next level? This is a bit more complex than Barsucci's tree now. But the initial ideation or the proof of concept track starts with a use case. Let's have the specific use case where we believe blockchain will make a big difference. It may or it may not. So you need to learn and ask yourself whether blockchain makes sense. Build an inventory of use cases. Probably it's the best idea to sparkle out all your thoughts and pick the right ones, build them together, and then say, OK, this makes sense. This is the low-hanging fruit we should go for. This is a difficult one to implement and too expensive. This is somehow making sense, but we don't know if our stakeholders are interested. These are all the key questions you should be asking yourself. Well, how well do the use cases leverage blockchain strengths is important, because you need to ask yourself, is it actually necessary? Can I do it in any other way? Can we do another way of verifying data authenticity or data access points? And then you down select a couple of them before you go for your project. And then you start building your proof of concept. This is a key point. This is a big pitfall. When you choose your proof of concept and define the scope of it, a lot of people want to go for the moonshot. It may simply be too difficult to go for what you initially believe to be an easy use case. We severely underestimate the effort to build such applications. So take a realistic view on it, and based on that realistic view of the effort required to deploy the application, try to see, well, OK, I mean, I'm giving myself a 3 to 6 months time to take this proof of concept and to put it to test. That's your second step. Of course, developing the technical architecture, the development roadmap, the Scrum, choosing the right blockchain stack technology, I find these relatively easy. You already know what's out on the market. You could always ask an expert whether they think this or that or the other platform would make the most sense. And typically the answer is relatively straightforward, because then, based on what your use case is, and I get this question a lot from people I meet, they ask me, we think of using this platform for our new proof of concept. Or they say, we've heard these new 5 platforms have been designed and put to market, and we would like to know which one is the best. Well, this is like a bicycle versus a skateboard versus a Ferrari. Well, do you need speed? Do you need low-cost running? Do you need large scale of operations? Are we getting a plane where we could use a bicycle? These are the questions you should be asking yourself, understand what platforms are available, and then choose the right technology for it. Technology you could always put as a second layer, but the use case and the best fit for that, just as you would wear the right suit for the right meeting, this is exactly the question you should be asking yourself. What technology? What use case? Does it match requirements? Once you have that in place, I think the use case evaluation framework, the viability, the desirability, the feasibility applied to a technology stack, it is relatively easy to build the application as long as you have experienced people on board who preferably had done this before. Because if not, the time to deployment will be significantly longer through the learning process. It's a different way of thinking in many cases, rather than just writing yet another application. I myself, as a previous coder, writing small snippets and applications, the thinking way of a distributed ledger application may be significantly more different because of the consensus mechanism behind than a regular application. So these are the pitfalls that must be considered as you move on forward with your applications. So you take the testing, the proof of concept. As I said earlier, people go for the moonshot. So don't go for the moonshot. Build a very small application. First, test your consensus, test your data sharing, understand whether this little snippet, this application, I would call it my term would be technological artifact. Not an app yet, not a minimum viable product, but a technological artifact, and then build upon it. The foundation would mean, well, if I'm doing let's say if I'm building a digital ID, first I'd like to know whether I can create an ID of myself, let alone have others sign this ID. And then build a second node that acts as a verifier node of my claim to an identity. My name is Burak Yetişkin. I live in this address in Zurich. I work at Deloitte Consulting in Zurich. And then Deloitte Consulting becomes a node, verifies I work there. The land registry verifies where I live. And then my identity, I claim myself. You see, starting from the very basic, the baby steps, and then building around this ecosystem is the way, iteratively, to build your application. One pitfall I've seen is that people want to do it all at once. That typically, there's two sides to it. One of them will be that people want results quick, and that's our nature, especially in the proof of concept. So having something small that works may work a lot better than building initially a large building floor by floor until the whole building is completed. It might make a lot more sense to go small and to grow the application. Well, what happens at the end of your proof of concept build is that you had initial ideas. Does this make sense? Shall I build this? You already have these answers when you have your proof of concept if you defined your metrics before you launch it. Meaning, well, I want to build this application that creates a digital ID for me. And I want to make sure that I can verify who I am within 5 minutes instead of 40 minutes, 50 minutes by sending papers. Define them before you build the app. Because if you don't, by the end of the POC, you would only have an app that just works. Build your metrics beforehand, see the effort required to make it real, and then verify it against your initial claim that blockchain will make a difference. This will give you two weapons. One of them is first, you will have a third person's view of whether what you thought actually will be the miracle drug. Basically, blockchain solves all the problems. Maybe it doesn't, but then you know it didn't. But you should set it on day one and not change your mind. It's like a weight loss goal. When I don't meet mine, I always look back and say, OK, I'm almost at that weight, but I'm not. So I should pull back and be more honest about it. And the second thing is, in an organization, you can always go back to your leadership and say, well, we thought blockchain would help us 30% cost reduction. Well, if you can quantify it and present it to your leadership and your peers, you have much more chances of taking it to the next level of scale. So the scale becomes a completely different ecosystem, because then, just like any other blockchain application, you have multiple stakeholders, live data feed, security challenges, system integration work. But I would say from proof of concept to scale will be significantly more difficult to pass than from scale to production. Reason being so is that the challenges that come at the point of scaling your application are known challenges. But the challenges between the proof of concept to scaling are specific to distributed ledger technology. And that will make a difference. So identifying these challenges, addressing those challenges, seeing whether blockchain makes sense, step one. Scaling, relatively easy. And system integration is still relatively easy in comparison to building something that no one has ever thought of. So what happens is the proof of concept typically stands with you, building your app, getting 1 or 2 sources of data. And it typically goes with building a pilot where you work with your partners, because nobody in this world wants to own the world's first fax machine. Distributed ledgers, as the name implies, requires multiple parties to collaborate. If you do not build an ecosystem where you have data feed from different parties, whether from the same stakeholders or multiple stakeholders being involved, that point wouldn't make much sense. So on the pilot phase, you first incubate your app, something starts working, you can fake some data input to it to see if the application makes sense, but then you ask your other stakeholders in the game to work with you and provide you data feeds. What typically happens is the biggest challenges come from reaching mutual agreement. That's why BCTR is here today, is to make sure multiple stakeholders from different industries are together on the same table discussing such applications. And then going to production level is still, comparative to everything we talked about, is a breeze. Instead of, let's say, having 5 people agree on a data scheme, what kind of data is shared, how long we hold data, how do we authorize the data sharing, these are a lot more critical questions you would come at the stage of the near-term pilot rather than the long-term production of the completely scaled ecosystem. And it becomes a snowball effect. It becomes a network effect, and things start to come much faster. So how do we go for proof of concept? Well, I would say relatively easy is the vision part. We have a lot of ideas, and everybody would like to share their ideas, and we challenge our ideas at a good round table. And then once the vision is set, well, this is what I want to do. Faster transactions, lower costs, easier reconciliation, easier data sharing. Once those are set, you, of course, have to put your targets with that and have some hypotheses and experiments of checking the validity of these claims. Are my transactions really slow? Real-life example. This morning, I realized that I don't have enough Turkish lira cash in my own account. I sent money from Zurich to my account. A very, very, very low amount just for the weekend, just to have cash in my pocket. I send it around 8 a.m. in the morning. I log into my online banking, make a transfer, non-SEPA transaction from a bank to a from a Swiss bank to a Turkish bank, and then I said priority transactions, which I paid around maybe 10, 50 liras, and the money was in my account 8 minutes later. Was it fast? Yeah. Would I want to make it faster? Maybe, but 8 minutes is bearable because once I go out tonight, I'll need the money. It's okay. Was it expensive? Yeah. Well, it was still expensive because after all, I transferred a very small amount just for a weekend cash. So I can verify, I want to make a blockchain ecosystem which would increase, perhaps not the speed but lower the cost of transactions, and I can verify it against a real claim. Not every use case that was piloted ever made that claim. Some of them simply said, well, this is faster, cheaper, stronger, let's do it. Let's verify those before you actually go to production. So the second step would be, of course, you have the idea, you have the outcomes, everything is set up and laid out. The second question is, of course, designing this application, the look and feel, the data connection points. It's a really comprehensive process depending on what kind of application you're building. But in most cases, it typically feeds everything. The design feeds everything into the specs, the tech specs, how it should be coded. And this is the reason why the bulb is big, is because it takes a lot of time to build the application. So after a review session, another quick experiment, you will have findings. The target of a proof of concept is to look back and say, does it make sense? The target of a proof of concept is not to deploy an application and say, OK, now it's working. You won't get there. You will only know whether it makes sense to pursue this. Think of it like cold water. You put your foot and tip your toe in it. And if it's too cold, you pull your leg back. That's your proof of concept. And that's the reason why you should be building a proof of concept application. So the application itself helps you to define the true MVP and a true solution. Look into the user story. So Burak wants to transfer money, clicks on this, ends up in his account. Let's detail this. How would it look like on a blockchain? These are the things you will discover on your proof of concept. What kind of infrastructure would I need? Who do I need to talk to? Which parties do they need to work with to make this work? These are all the points that you identify the example proof of concept scope. So, but the outcome and benefit, as I repeat, is desired outcomes depends on the use case, and we have seen that it's mostly about data sharing related topics. You might say, I have 15 companies that need to verify data or align on data, and that can be, for example, a very valid case, and you could easily verify. You can look into speed of operations. You can look into cost of operations, which is perhaps a bit more difficult, because you really don't know the cost until you go full production-level deployments. And we've seen quite a lot of offshoots, especially exponentially growing offshoots, when you go to production-level deployment on distributed ledgers. So complexity-wise, the proof of concept is the toe you tip in cold water. So it's relatively easy. Hands-on experience, I could say anything from ranging from 10, 20 weeks. Based on the use case, this can be more, this can be less. This is not definitive. But mostly 10, 20 weeks should be enough for you to come up with something that works. And that application is typically not connected to anything. It just stands on its own. You can play with it. You can see the outcomes of it. And that's sufficient to say, OK, let's look into a medium complexity of application, which is a minimum production level deployment, meaning it's no longer my incubated app that's isolated. Now it's an application that can talk to people, which is the true purpose of a distributed ledger application. What happens is the time grows significantly higher, not because of the complexity of the core application, but because of the complexity of the system integration with multiple parties. The high complexity comes when you have the connections built, but need to ensure data security, need to ensure the number of oracles around it. And this would, of course, go up to a year or more, depending on the application you're looking into. There are applications that's been invested for 18 months before they got some tangible production-level results. No? Ah, OK. So how do we design our blockchain architecture? This is more of a tech topic, but you should also see it from a design thinking topic, not only about how do we build an architecture that will make sure we can take 10,000 applications in a minute. That's something I would ask a solution architect to. But I could ask, how can I design a blockchain application that will be accepted? Well, then the question comes, it's about, is it future-friendly? Is it the ease of use? Is it platform-agnostic? Is it enterprise-friendly? Am I building an application that would not integrate with any of my existing tools? Because if so, it is very unlikely that my IT leadership would say yes to proceeding forward. Nobody wants to spend so much time, effort, or even risk the existing operations. They would want to keep things intact as much as possible. One example is an application I built at the time where there were two options before a corporation: full-scale integration versus a blockchain application that remains as a layer over existing siloed databases. As long as you have minimal impact to the existing model but still create tangible value by a blockchain application, everybody were thumbs up. No big impact. All relevant systems are still working as they are. Worst case scenario, if it doesn't work, we could fall back to the old systems. Those are the models that get accepted by the leadership, both the IT and business, which you can proceed with. And how do we assess the viability of these? Well, make sure you do a spike testing, meaning make sure that scalability is no longer a topic that you have in mind. Well, will it work in blockchain? Make sure you test it first before you keep on investing. If you find out 52 weeks later that what you invested in would have never worked in blockchain, that's a big loss. And you would have to make a very good explanation as to why you said yes to that project in the first place. So make sure you ask the vendors and know their roadmap. The technology is evolving super rapidly. By the time when we first built the POCs versus today has been a significant time. So I'm thinking, since then, I think easily I have applications which were completely revised 4 or 5 times, recoded twice as they moved on to production level deployment. Getting feedback from the platform vendors as to what they plan to do with their platform is an essential information you need to have in your pocket before you proceed further. And of course, make sure you align with the experts whether you're doing the right thing. In terms of testing, in terms of platform, always ask for a second thought, and always try to get as much input as possible to make sure you're on the safe side in relation to new technologies that are emerging. So the last question that I'd like to highlight, and so time-wise as well, I'll try to be pretty quick on this one to leave some time for the Q&A, is about the strategy. This is something coming from an IT background, had some, well, not frequently asked question. Do we always ask how and why of why we're building these applications? When we're looking at a blockchain application, we need to, maybe you might be familiar with this diagram. It's the strategy cascade, the strategy and ambition. Why are we doing this? The very initial question, why are we doing this? So what makes us winning? What we will play with this application, with this platform? How will we win if we build a production-level deployment on this? And what are the capabilities we must have in our hand? What management systems do we need? This is a generic approach which should and easily can be applied to most blockchain production level deployments. There's a very good reason why we're building blockchain applications. Either it makes it better and faster, so improvement of operations, not cost reduction wise, but typically as being able to create new products on the fly through collaborating together. Or we can build applications as a cost reduction tool to make operations faster or lower cost, or both. In many cases, one or the other. But in every case, whenever we build an application, we have a winning claim. Meaning, if I build a digital ID solution, or if I'm building a consortium of money transfer today, what is my winning scheme? Shall I say, I'm making a new money movement scheme because it's a faster scheme? How will I compete against the existing paradigm? How will I play? Am I going to go for retail payments? Am I going for corporate payments? And if so, which entities do I compete against when I build my tools? What will be the factor that will make me win against them? Is it the ease of implementation? Is it the total cost of ownership? Those are the key questions in your exploration of your strategy and ambition before you go to a production level deployment. It may be very early stage of discussions if you're at a POC level, but the moment you go to pilot, revising and looking into your strategy again is essential before you go to complete up to scale full production level deployment. So the strategies that actually win are the strategies that make you win both financially and operationally, or typically both come together. So if I'm building a new blockchain ecosystem that will revolutionize the way payments work, or identity management works, or any other use case works today and supply chain works, I would have to ask myself, will I actually be doing a better business by deploying it? So the most successful deployments of blockchain are those that has a financial output. And those ideas by startups, which were initially pitched, those that survived, and we just had earlier today in the morning, why these startups live only 1.22 years before they die out? Well, not all of them had a very good commercial background to what they said. They said it's going to revolutionize everything, but they didn't have the basis to defend it. They didn't test the application. They didn't have, maybe some of them didn't have a strong proof of concept to back it up, and they didn't have enough of a commercial drive or strategy to make it a win. So this is what good looks like. If you're going to look at how the strategy and ambition should look, where do you play? Which industry do I go for? Or do I act multi-industry in a use case? And after all, it's all about collaboration. What channels do I go through? How do I have better capabilities or differentiators through building a blockchain ecosystem? And who are our competitors? So if it's about payments, we know the players. If it's about supply chain, we know the players today. If it's about certification, there are entities that are readily established. So make sure you identify who they are, make sure you identify your winning proposition, and make sure you revise your strategy after your pilot deployment before you go to production level deployment. And the platform types today are relatively straightforward, I would say, because when I look at, I was just reading a case of Alibaba, of how it became to be the massive entity it is today, or Amazon and Jeff Bezos as the wealthiest man on earth today. These are all platform players. Today, the winning platforms are platform plays. They interlink. They don't hold stock. They don't hold products and sell it to you. How many of us actually remember there was a petshop.com or something similar website where you can get pet supplies in the US 10, 12 years ago, one of the first websites, didn't become very successful. Warehousing, holding goods, shipping them, quite a difficult work. Look at eBay. They own nothing, they had a website. And then you can sell things, and you are onboarding a platform, and you can buy things. You register. Platform play, and especially aggregation play, has been massively successful. We are at an era where we can take a cab without owning the cab, and the company that organizes it happens to own no cars. The company that organizes my place I stay at, which is Airbnb, owns no flats. But what happens is, it's a matchmaking process in the era of connectivity that makes you win. And the platforms that are designed, the winning platforms, the winning production level deployments, are those that interlink entities. Pretty much a promise of distributed ledger technologies, interlinking entities to communicate with each other. Of course, there's very interesting platforms now. I mean, social platforms, interactions, connecting individuals to communities. But aggregation of input had yielded massive success. Designing blockchain ecosystems, designing blockchain consortia, which had been massively successful, has always been about aggregating them together, even if at Amazon you will have multiple sellers which compete on the same product. Well, it may happen to be the case, but they all are okay to go on the platform and win by creating a different deal or sending at AliExpress, which I shop myself. Some of them send a little gift, some of them do free shipping, some of them ship it faster, and I go and buy what they provide. So the challenge in such platforms where the buyers and the sellers or multiple entities interact and interconnect is typically that you need to kickstart it. So you might have a beautiful website where you could intuitively click and buy things, and people might want to onboard it, but without a strong engine to kickstart the snowball effect, likely it won't succeed very well. You need to interlink all the buyers and all the sellers together to make it a successful platform play. So there's various ways to make sure all the participants are in the same ecosystem. Very much the promise of blockchain, having multiple entities interact with each other. And to do so, well, there's various methods. Of course, you can go as the seeding, so Google paid Android developers to build apps so that people use their app store. You could easily go for piggybacking. You can just take some information and parse it and put it in. You can try to build, well, Tinder organized sorority part is a very funny one, using opportunistic push marketing to attract attention. But each and every of those wanted to make sure that the engine has an initial kickstart, the buyers and the sellers, the two sides of the transaction, are on the same platform as fast as possible, and the snowball effect follows near instantaneously. So that's one of the key elements of discussion. How do we build a production-level, scaled-up blockchain system where we have all participants on board as fast as possible, and how can we solve the chicken and egg problem of getting everyone on board, and how can we incentivize making this model work? This is a production-level deployment, or near-production-level deployment, I should name. Is anyone familiar with this model when you look at it? This is something that's been publicly published a couple of weeks back. This is a central bank-driven currency model. Anyone? This is from Monetary Authority of Singapore, where you have multiple entities interacting together. There is 11 banks. Along with those, you have the regulator on the same network of a distributed ledger. Along with that, the central bank is in the same play, but not only the central bank has a direct connection to the electronic payment systems. Okay, let's revert back to minute one. We said, find an idea. Electronic currency is easier to manage. We don't want to move cash around. It's just difficult. Idea two, test it with multiple parties. Banks came together, went to the regulator, went to the central bank and said, hey, this makes sense. Can we pilot it? Third came scaling. How do we make it large enough that we are able to handle the same volume of transactions that we handle today? And then the question comes, now that we have an application, a minimum viable product, how can we convert this into a minimum viable ecosystem where the buyers and the sellers, or all the participants that should be in the network, are in place? And that's how it ended up to be. A distributed ledger-based scaling application of 11 banks, a regulator, a central bank, and an electronic payment system in place in Singapore. That's Ubin. So all the concepts that I've discussed so far are actually interlinked together when you look at the final result of a working, real blockchain application in place. So these are scalable value propositions in business models. For them, it made absolute sense because digital currency is easier to handle. For the central bank, it makes sense because funds transfers between the banks are being handled. For Singapore, it made absolute sense from a regulatory standpoint because now you have a node where you can see the transaction flow. And there's many others like this. So you can keep your channels open, so to say, to think of alternative models, alternative ecosystems, and refer back to new revenue models which generate value for all the participants and not only one, and can go fully up to scale. Back.
Awesome.
I think Burak had left the building.
Açık mı? Mikrofon
Thank you.
açık. Burak, I guess that was a little more than a presentation, but more like an accelerator service. And let's ask if the audience has any questions.
I told you I'm the last person standing between the weekend and the last presentation, so not sure.
The gentleman over there?
Can Doğan orada Eskişehir, İstanbul. According to your observations and experience, which would be a more likely success story, targeting a current market and grabbing a share of it, creating a new market using this blockchain technology and smart contracts, or just creating a new market, coming up with something pioneering?
Well, I mean, this depends on the use case very much. Google was targeting something that was in the very beginning, the baby steps of search engine indexing was in place. I remember using Alta Vista, which doesn't exist, unfortunately, anymore. They targeted something that was almost brand new, not completely new. Well, Amazon, of course, targeted something that was just a buzz in the market. Depending on the use case, it might be a better idea to create a market, if there is demand for it, and take a massive risk that comes with it. Versus trying to target an existing market. Because the moment you go to an existing market, or as blockchain typically does, address an operations that is already taking place and making better, the demand is already there. You don't ask yourself the question, shall I actually build this? Does it actually make sense? Because if it didn't, they wouldn't make it. So it's an easier bet sometimes to go into a model where you target an existing operation and make it better. But there may be some opportunities out there that's completely revolutionizing the way we do business. I think IoT devices and combinatorial technologies especially is that seed. We never thought of linking a MEMS device, a micro electromechanical device, and then linking it to the 3G network, and then having it report to us, and then have big data, run analytics on it. These are all new things. And there's so many things we can newly address which we previously haven't imagined. So it's very much of a, I know it's not a sharp answer of yes and no, but I think per case, it should be individually assessed.
Thank you very much for coming out, everyone.